Let's get some wider analysis. We're joined by Samuel Ramani, who's Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Good evening to you, sir. Deployment of Wagner mercenaries. Could this be a possible turning point?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily a turning point. I think the fact that the Russia's having to bring more than 1,000 Wagner troops, as well as some of their senior officers from the group, into the conflict is a sign that the border force that they brought in to invade is not doing the job. Sergei Shoigu noted that there were 138,000 new Russians who were conscripted for the year, but those conscripted forces are not going to be sent to the hot zone. So the option is either bring in Wagner or bring in Syrians, Central Africans, more Chechens, and people from other regions.
And in terms of what that means then, the use of these mercenaries, how do you see things developing on the ground?
Well, I think that the Wagner Group forces have traditionally been much more effective in terms of providing training of forces, which is not necessarily needed in the Russian case because this is the Russian army. It's more effective in places like Libya, or in terms of like a guardianship of stationary facilities. So they're better in the defensive capacity. They're trying to hold the line. When Wagner Group has been offensive, purely on its own or in conjunction with local proxies and surrogates in Libya, Mozambique, and even to some extent Central African Republic, its success has been much more limited. And this is an offensive operation, so I'm not expecting much success.
In terms of how the West will react, will this deployment of Wagner affect that, do you think?
Well, the Wagner Group is not really a company, right? And Yevgeny Prigozhin, who's widely viewed as the leading figure within the Wagner Group and Putin's chef, is really more of a middleman. So it's very difficult to really punish Prigozhin or the Wagner Group, even though Britain, the United States, and the European Union have sanctioned him and it to various degrees. But how the West will really react is that this is a sign that Russia is not really serious about peace. If Russia was serious about peace, they wouldn't be bringing 1,000 fighters who are known for egregious human rights abuses, ranging from the deployment of landmines to even the use of chemical weapons in Libya. That's not really the step that you'd be bringing if you want to actually end this war.
Hear what you're saying. And when Vladimir Putin makes it known that he's willing to curb attacks on Kyiv as a kind of gesture of trust, do you feel that the likes of Antony Blinken, Joe Biden, and various voices in Ukraine are right to say, Vladimir Putin, we don't believe you?
I think that they have good reason to be right at this point in time. First of all, Vladimir Medinsky, the Russian chief negotiator, has not only backtracked on the desire for an immediate ceasefire. I said that it's conditional, it's dependent on things on the ground, it's gradual. So the Russians are already backtracking on their agreement to de-escalate there over the past couple of hours. And the statements coming out of the Russian Ministry of Defense in particular, which just said that there were 4.5 million human shields in cities like Kiev and Chernihiv, implies that Russia is going to carry out more military operations in those cities. Maybe not now, as they're focusing on the liberation of Donbass, but certainly in the near future.
And in terms of Mariupol, the situation there, of course, is alarming, to say the very least. It's a humanitarian disaster in one respect, but of course it's been constructed by the Russian siege and bombardment. Emmanuel Macron on the phone with Vladimir Putin today. The conditions aren't right, says Putin, for any kind of humanitarian mission to be sent to Mariupol. What does that tell us about Vladimir Putin's real aims and objectives?
Well, Vladimir Putin basically told Emmanuel Macron that the militants, as he called them, in Mariupol need to surrender. And given the fact that there isn't a distinguish between Ukrainian nationalists and civilians, the Russians are basically saying that Mariupol has to surrender or the attacks will continue. And that's not really conducive for peace. And unfortunately, that's also not conducive for humanitarian evacuation that France has been trying to plan with Greece and Turkey.
And in terms of the fact that places like Irpin are now falling back into, we're told it's 95% back in Ukraine hands. There's been progress at Kharkiv in the northeast of the country. This is indicative of how things haven't worked so far for Vladimir Putin and the Russian invasion. The introduction now of the Wagner mercenaries, perhaps the response to that. Do you feel that the fact that the Ukrainian forces have made this kind of progress, that it's a vindication of the tactics that have been used by the West in terms of not providing the no-fly zone, not providing anything other than the financial and the hardware backing?
Well, it's hard to call that a vindication. I think that it's basically a risk assessment that came from the West. If there was a no-fly zone, given the unpredictability of Vladimir Putin's recent conduct, given the repeated mentions by Russian officials about the nuclear button, there was an unacceptable risk of a nuclear war. So the West took a gamble. that if they provided the Ukrainians with anti-tank missile systems and more small arms, that the Ukrainian resistance and resolve would ultimately be able to withstand the Russian invasion. It looks as if that gambit was correct. But if Russia had entered Ukraine with a much larger invasion force that brought divisions from other regions of the country, if their supply issues had been sorted, the logistical issues had been sorted, and they were able to get reinforcements much more quickly from other places like Belarus and Syria, then maybe we'd be talking about a different outcome. So I think in some ways the West has managed this risk, but the West also got lucky in terms of helping Ukraine at this point.
Indeed, it sounds like you're saying that it's the logistical issues that have been just as big an issue rather than or as much as the resistance that Ukraine has put up. Samuel, thank you very much indeed. Samuel Ramani from the Royal United Services Institute. Thank you so very much for giving us that analysis of where we are right now with Ukraine. And of course, we continue to chart all developments of the crisis.